All right, so before we get started, I feel like it's important that you know at least the basic idea of how the process of getting and loading a web page in your browser works. So, for some of you, this may be very simple. You may already know this stuff. For some of you, this may be very confusing and daunting. If it is confusing, just know that you'll understand this process more as time goes on, and you don't need to know it to start building websites. I think a good metaphor for this is that you don't need to know how an engine works to be able to learn how to drive a car. And the stuff that I'm going to talk about here in this section, it all happens under the hood. So if you're a beginner and you're just stepping into this world, don't worry if you don't understand this stuff. I just think it's important to mention before we start. All right, so we all use the internet every day, but most people don't know how it actually works. And they just know they go to, Facebook.com or whatever, and it loads their profile, their social media. So I'm going to try to explain what actually goes on under the hood in very simple terms. Basically, the internet is a global network of computers and devices, and these computers have what's called an IP address to uniquely identify them, just like an actual address for your home. And these IP addresses, they're assigned to you by your internet service providers. And they're usually in the form of 4 numbers with dots in between, just like this here. Now, this is a version 4 IP address. There's also version 6 IP addresses that are much longer. And these were created for when we run out of version 4 IP addresses. And you can actually go to Google and just search "what's my IP," and you'll find different sites that will actually trace it and show it to you if you want to know what your current IP address is. Now, even if you have multiple devices in your home, like let's say you have 2 computers, a tablet, a mobile device, each of these devices, they all have what's called a private IP address that is only local to your network, your home network. Your router, however, has a public IP address, and that's the IP address that the internet actually sees. All the private ones for each device, that's only within your home network or your office network, whatever it may be. All right, now the way that computers talk to each other is over something called the TCP/IP protocol. And a protocol is basically just a way for computers to communicate, almost like a language, so they can speak to each other. Don't worry too much about this. If you're getting into computer networking and stuff like that, it's very important to understand the different network layers and so on, how data packets are sent. But that's not important for what we're doing here, or even to become a web developer. Now, HTTP is a little more important for you to understand. This stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And if you notice, when you type in a website URL like google.com, Facebook, you're usually doing HTTP or HTTPS. HTTPS is for secure connections using an SSL certificate, and we'll talk more about that later. But basically, HTTP is what's called an application layer protocol, and it actually runs over TCP, and it's responsible for handling web traffic between a browser like Google Chrome or Firefox and a web server that stores a website, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide. So HTTP is one of many types of application layer protocols. You also have, for instance, SMTP, which deals with email. You have FTP and SSH. These deal with transferring files over the internet. HTTP, however, is going to be the one you deal with the most in web development. So websites and web pages are basically just files that are stored on computers that run a piece of software called a web server. And an example of a web server would be Apache or Nginx. Don't worry if you've never heard of these before. Technically, you could run a web server from your home on a computer, but most ISPs prohibit doing that, and you probably wouldn't want to do that anyways, because if for some reason the computer shuts off or something happens, your website goes down. So what you usually do is you can build a website on your local machine at your home or office, and then you would upload it to a hosting company, okay, or to a server that a hosting company owns. And there's all different types of hosting accounts. You can actually get a dedicated server, which is an actual computer that's dedicated to you for your use, but those are really expensive. You have shared hosting where you share accounts on one server with other people. This is much cheaper, and I'll go over the different types of hosting in a later section. But that's basically what you're going to do, is use a hosting company. And in addition to that, you're going to need a domain name. which can be a .com, .net, .org, and many other TLDs. Now, remember, all computers, including web servers, have an IP address, but it would really suck if you wanted to go to Facebook or Google and you had to remember something like 7522.128.131. So what happens is when you type in, for instance, http://www.facebook.com, there's something called a DNS, or a domain name service, that actually maps that domain to the correct IP address of facebook.com or whatever website you're visiting. And this makes our lives much easier. Otherwise, you'd probably have a notebook with hundreds of numbers for each website that you want to visit. So later on, I'm actually going to show you how to register a domain name and how to upload a website to a web hosting account. All right, so let's take a quick look at a diagram that kind of explains what we've been talking about. So you, the user, down at the bottom, types in, let's say, google.com into a web browser, and this could be Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, Firefox, Safari, any web browser, and the DNS server looks at the domain name, such as google.com, and it maps it to the IP address that's needed, as you can see right here. Okay, once it gets that IP address, it then makes what's called an HTTP request to the web server of that IP address. And then that web server will return a response with the HTML file that needs to be loaded, any other files, including CSS files, which are used for styling. You have any images that are on the page, those will get sent, and whatever else is needed for google.com to be loaded in your browser. Now, these HTTP requests, they're made when you load a web page as well as when you, for instance, submit a form. Okay, and there's different types of requests, there's different status codes, but that's all stuff you're going to learn later on when you get into scripting and programming. You don't need to know that stuff to create basic static web pages with HTML and CSS.